Hello and welcome to this webinar. This webinar is going to be talking about some of the exam techniques to use for the Level 2 reading exam. This is going to focus on the Edexcel exams. So if you're using another examining body, although the content will be similar, the style of the exam is a bit different. So do make sure that you're only doing Edexcel if you're watching this recording. Now this recording is going to focus on the technique to use for the exam. So it will assume that you know the content already, although there will be some brief explanations. If there are some topics as we go through you feel you're not very confident in, there are some other webinars that you can watch that will teach you a bit more about how to answer the questions and exactly what some of the vocabulary means, exactly what they're looking for. So this is just an overview to just help you revise and prepare for the actual examination. So we'll go through the style of the questions, a couple of example answers, and exactly how they're looking for you to answer those questions. So what we'll be looking at is some general strategy. So this is the first tip I would give you. A lot of the questions will say you don't need to write in full sentences, and this sometimes confuses people because they're not quite sure what it means. It means don't give just a one-word answer. Occasionally that's fine, but a lot of the time a one-word answer won't fulfill the criteria for the question. It means you need to write a full enough answer to fully answer the question, but your sentence construction, your punctuation, and your spelling will not be marked. So don't worry too much about trying to put all the commas in the right places, checking your spelling. Because it's a reading exam, those things are not examined. So long as the examiner can understand what you've written, then that's absolutely fine. A bit of a word on time management. For this particular exam, for Edexcel, you have an hour, 60 minutes. It's generally enough time to answer the exam, but sometimes people do struggle. If they get caught up on a question, they spend a long time on it. They can also spend a long while if they're looking things up in the dictionary, because you can have access to a dictionary. And I would suggest that if one isn't provided by your centre, take your own dictionary with you and just show it to the examiner before you start. Because occasionally there can be things you can look up and it will help you just to understand the question a bit more. So make sure you do answer all the questions within the time. An obvious one, but sometimes people get sidetracked. They don't answer the last two or three. And often the last couple can be quite long answers, quite big marks. So if you don't answer those, you're reducing your chances of passing. I'd always suggest go through. If you can answer a question, do. If you find a question difficult, leave it, go back to it at the end. Do make sure you have enough time to answer those long questions. There's often a 4 or 5 marker, a couple of those, but do make sure you have enough time to answer those. If you do want to look things up in the dictionary, I'd leave those questions again until the end so you're giving yourself a bit more time. If you're doing the online version of the exam, some people can find it a little bit fiddly to be flicking between the two parts. So it's worth having a go at the practice exam that Edexcel have on their website, just to get yourself used to how that exam works and how to find all the different elements. The biggest tip I'll give you for that is to remember to scroll down and read all of the information. I've had a couple of students who hadn't realised they needed to scroll, and so they were only answering based on the top few paragraphs of the text. So make sure you've read everything. Another little tip I'll give is that often for the reading exam, sometimes the answers can be not hidden, but not as obvious. They may be right at the top in some kind of heading or header, and right at the bottom in a footer, something that we tend to ignore as readers, and we tend to focus on the main paragraph. But do make sure you've had a look all around the text at any captions, pictures, headings, subheadings, bits that might be hidden at the top and bottom, so that you can find all the information you need. Here are some of the types of questions that you might come across. The questions, what does the writer think or believe? Some questions on explaining idioms, main purpose questions, questions on locating and interpreting information, language features and text features, advice questions, choosing quotations, explaining how ideas are similar or different, and choosing a text and justifying it. That's just a general overview. There are some other questions in there, but generally they do fit into those categories. And you will expect to get a question in each of those categories on every exam. Edexcel tends to be quite structured in the way the questions are put together, so you can usually predict exactly which question is coming next. So if you do a few practice exams, you'll get used to the style and the layout of the questions. There are some multiple choice at level 2, not too many, but there are some. And occasionally they will ask you to choose 2 or even sometimes 3 options. And I have had people who've missed out because they assume there's only one answer. So do read the question carefully to check the answers for the multiple choice question. So here's just an example of how multiple choice might look. According to text A, and it will always ask you to look at the text, you never use your own knowledge. The Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition believes that, and then you've got A, B, C, and D. Now, what you'll normally find is, although examiners don't try to trap you, I sometimes say there are traps in the question in that there are things people can do that might confuse them or ways they can get distracted. So what you tend to find with these questions is that often there are 2 answers you can almost eliminate straight away. And then there are 2 that normally are quite similar. And you'll usually find that both of the ideas are mentioned slightly in the text, but one of them is mentioned more exactly, or the other one is perhaps mentioned, but in this case it may not be to do with the Scientific Advisory Committee. It could be someone else mentioning people should try to eat less sugar. So it's always sticking to the exact question, using the words in the question, and then finding the option that fits best for the multiple choice. It's useful for you as well as a student to look at the marking guidelines. If you go on the Excel site, there are some practice ones you can download, and you can download the mark scheme as well. When you're going through the test, it will show you the number of marks for each question. Use these as a guide to tell you how much to write. So if it's a 3-mark question, generally you should make 3 separate points. If you want to make 4 points, that's fine. I wouldn't make 10 points because that just shows that you're a bit confused about the question. As I've said before, the big mark questions tend to be around questions 8, 9, 10. So don't miss those out and look carefully at those marks. If they're 4 and 5 mark questions, you need to be making a few different points in order to hit all of the marks. One of the questions that tends to come up near the start, often question 3, sometimes question 1, is around the main purpose of the text. The main purpose is the main point of the text. And that's the why did somebody actually bother to write this piece in the first place? And there's a really specific technique to use to answer this question. This is something that tends to be badly done. So out of all the questions on the exam, this is the one most people get wrong. And it's all about structuring your answer carefully. You always structure your answer with a verb at the start and then almost a summary of the main purpose in the next part of your sentence. And that summary should be specific. So here's an example of something you could write as a main purpose of a text: to persuade people to visit their hotel. So the question would have said, what is the main purpose of text A? And your answer would be to persuade people to visit their hotel. So persuade is the verb, it's the action they want people to do. So it could be to advise, to inform, lots of different purposes. The visit their hotel is the specific point of the text, and then you've covered the question. As we've said, don't miss out that verb. If you just put it's about a hotel, that's not specific enough. It doesn't have the verb, and you wouldn't get the marks for that question. I would definitely advise practicing some main purpose questions and looking at the mark schemes to see exactly what they're looking for. There will also be a webinar that covers that particular. There's usually quite a few questions on the topic of locating or interpreting information, because obviously that's a main skill in reading. They will often ask you to choose a quote or an example or evidence to go with that. Always look again for traps in the question. So look very carefully at what they're asking you to do, and be careful not to use your own knowledge. So if it's a topic that you know a bit about, make sure you only use information that you've read in the text. Don't add in something that you know in real life that isn't mentioned in the text. I'll show you a couple of examples of questions around locating information. So which statement below is an accurate summary of points made in the text? And this question, often the last question, will ask you to compare two texts. And again, when you usually read them, at first all four seem reasonable. You just need to go through and look carefully at the wording. So in example A, published reports, that's the bit I'd be looking at. Do they both have published reports mentioned? Food producers, so is that mentioned? So advice, are they both advising? Are these two talking about a ban? So you can go through and eliminate answers. Now the second question, this is an earlier one. In text B, the paragraph beginning Oliver does not allow suggests that, and again there's four options. Now a way that you could fall into a bit of a trap here is that maybe part C is mentioned, but it's not in the particular paragraph here, it's in an earlier or a later paragraph. So with these questions, make sure you're only looking at the paragraph they're asking you to refer to and not to anything else. And then again, just checking the wording of the question to see if it fits exactly with that paragraph. So that's around locating information. There'll always be an advice question. So they will ask you to use the text or text to give advice to a friend that they've made up for you. So it'll be on the topic, obviously, of one of the texts. Again, don't add in your own knowledge. They'll generally ask you to use two different texts, so make sure you look carefully and pick the two they're asking you for. People have made mistakes by using a different text. And if it's asking you to do two, make sure that you actually refer to both of those in your answers, not just to one of them. Again, stick to the question and watch for traps. So I'm going to show you a trap in this next example that some people will fall into. So your friend has done everything she can to reduce her sugar intake, but wants to continue to improve her diet. Using text A and text C, advise your friend of what she can do to improve her diet, apart from reducing her sugar intake. Now, it's that last part that a lot of people will go wrong on. So apart from reducing her sugar intake. So this means that in your answers, you must not refer to anything that's about reducing sugar. And a lot of people will forget that, and they'll go back to the text and they'll just copy out any bits that are to do with improving diet, whether they're to do with sugar or not. So always look for the words apart from in the question and be really careful not to mention that in your answer. Now you can see at the bottom, that's a 5-mark question. So that's one of the biggest questions on there. This question actually, unless people fall into the trap, is usually done quite well, because all you need to do is pick out 5 things your friend can do. You don't need to write in long sentences, so don't start off with one thing that my friend could do to improve her diet. You don't need that part. You can just list things she can do. So eat more fruit and vegetables would be a long enough answer to get a mark. And again, make sure you use both text A and text C. So I would perhaps pick 2 or 3 answers from one and 2 from the other. You don't have to tell the examiner which text you're using, but it can be helpful. And I often find it's useful to give the examiner pointers to what you're doing. So I may even write a little heading at the top, text A, make 3 points, and then write text C and make 2 points. And that's a good way to make sure you're getting 5 marks already on your paper. Choosing quotations. In quite a few questions, they'll ask you to back them up with evidence. Sometimes this may be a direct quotation. Sometimes it's fine to paraphrase. Look for the wording in the question to tell you which they're looking for. Always be specific. Only quote the relevant parts. Don't quote a whole paragraph or a really long sentence. Just pick out the words that are relevant to the question. But do quote enough to make your point. Sometimes one word is enough, but usually you'll need perhaps 3 or 4 to make it. And here's an example of something they would ask for: a piece of evidence. You're interested in the effect too much sugar has on health. Identify one piece of evidence from each of the 3 texts that tells you about the effect too much sugar has on health. So we're looking for quotations we can put in, and we need the quotations to be around too much sugar and the effect on health. So that's the bit we need to be careful of, not to talk about something that isn't sugar, or not to talk about an effect that's not healthy. On the next slide, we'll just see an example of how you could answer that question using this text. So here's the text. It's not the whole text, there is a bit more, but I just wanted to show you the length of the text. And there's a few things we could pick out. If we look particularly at these bullet points, all of these would probably be acceptable. We wouldn't necessarily need to write the whole sentence out. You could do if you really wanted, but it's not necessary. What you wouldn't want to do is copy out a whole paragraph like the one that starts the Scientific Advisory Committee, because that shows that you're not picking specific information. You might not get the full mark. So this type of answer here, text A, greater risk of tooth decay, answers the question, tells you a tooth decay, tells you there's a risk, and that was specifically linked to this point here: high levels of sugar consumption are linked to greater risk of tooth decay. So that would be an absolutely fine answer to give. Wouldn't take you too long to write out. Some people spend a long time either typing or copying out bits from the text. Generally on the exam, you're not able to copy and paste if you're doing the online one, so you will need to type things yourself. There'll always be a question that refers in some way to features of text. Now remember that features of text are the things you can see. Now if you're not confident with this topic, I'd suggest you have a look at the webinar all around features of text. Now the question sometimes hides behind wording that isn't obvious. It may not say features of text. It may say methods used to present ideas, presentation features, layout features, methods the writer uses to convey information. So there's quite a few different ways that that question can come up. And again, this is where doing some practice exams will be useful so that you can see the style of words. Here's a few examples of things that you can answer for features of text questions. So you might say bold subheadings, bold or large font headings or titles, bullet points, diagrams, pictures, images, highlighted or underlined text. There's loads and loads of features out there. There's probably a good 20 or so different types of features that you could list in your exam. Do be specific when you're giving your answer. Edexcel are quite fussy on the mark scheme in terms of how they give the marks. In the past, they've said that just saying bold on its own, without a description of what is bold, so saying bold heading, or bold is used for the keyword holidays, will not be accepted. They also say they won't accept things like title or heading without an additional feature to go with that. So bold heading, large font title, or heading uses a different font. So try to be specific with those features because the mark scheme could be quite strict. Occasionally on the exam, they will ask you not just to identify features of text, but to identify features that highlight a particular type of text. So they might ask the features that show the text is a letter, or features that show the text is a web page. And with that, you need to be even more specific with those features. So just saying bold heading wouldn't really indicate it's a letter. So what you would do for those is to look for things that show it, that identify and are used almost exclusively on that type of text. So in an email, the to and from would be specific. The subject and attachment, those would all be things that would be specific to an email. A letter, the addresses, the date, the yours sincerely, would all be specific to a letter. And on a web page, the links, the menu, the toolbar would be specific to a web page. So again, this is about checking the wording of the question and making sure your answer fits that wording. Again, if that's something you're not very confident with, have a look at the webinar on features of text. Some questions will talk about fact and opinion and also bias, which we'll mention later. These questions, although they seem obvious, people do make a lot of mistakes here, and that's usually because they tend to choose examples that aren't very clear. Always choose the most obvious examples. So try to identify the things that can be proved or checked by someone when you're identifying facts. And look particularly for statistics or figures to show something as a fact. So if it says a quarter of residents voted against the proposal, that would be a fact. Look for adjectives to show something is an opinion. So if there's something that says it was a terrible idea to reduce the amount of users on the roads, then terrible would be that opinion word. So that would be a good quote to go with opinion. Adjectives, any adjectives to do with descriptions around what people think, then that's a good one to choose for the opinion-based questions. Coming on to bias, some people are a bit confused about what bias is. And occasionally you'll actually get a question that asks you to explain it. And one explanation would be to say, it's when a person is only giving their opinion, which has been influenced by their personal feelings or connections in some way. So I always give a clear example of bias to do with football, because generally if people like football, they have a particular team that they support. And if you're watching a match where your team is playing, and perhaps the referee makes a decision that some people don't agree with, because you have support for a particular team, you will always agree with that team's idea and you'll always be against the other team. You might make a comment that the referee made a terrible decision, and that would be a biased opinion because you have a reason to support your particular team. If you were being objective, or perhaps someone who didn't like football was looking, they would be able to give a perhaps more objective view of that decision. How can you tell if a text is biased? So look at things like, does it only look at one side of an argument? Does it only choose facts or statistics that back up the argument they're making? Does it use emotive language or phrases? And if there's an opinion from an expert, is there only one, and does that back up their point? Often it will ask you to give a quote from a text, or you can quote from the text, but if you just quote from the text and don't explain it, then that won't be enough to get the mark on that question. Come on to language features. We've mentioned text features. We now need to look at language features. So text features were things that we saw. Language features are the words the writer uses. And this is another area where people tend to lose marks because they get a bit confused. Again, you can spot these questions by wording such as methods to convey information. How does the writer make their point? It won't always use the words language features in the question. So again, just think about that wording. Occasionally, it's even a multiple choice question. Here are some examples of language features. Again, there's probably 20 or so different ones. I would definitely advise you to go and revise some of the language features that could come up. And again, there will be a webinar talking about those. So some features you might look for: direct address, such as words like you and your. So you're addressing your audience directly. Using informal language or slang in the text. using imperative verbs or instructive language, patterns of three, alliteration, and we could go on and on. So do make sure you have learnt some of those language features. Here's an example of a multiple choice language features question. In text B, long-lasting legacy is an example of, we've got 4 options. Is it a command, alliteration, a metaphor, or a cliche? So you would need to know obviously what alliteration is, what a metaphor is, and what a cliche is in order to be able to answer that. And just to help you out, this one, if you're not confident, is alliteration because it's repeating the L sound. And alliteration is repeating the sound at the beginning of the word in 2 or more words. If it's not a multiple choice question, it's often a longer answer question. Now this one's quite unique because it combines language and layout features, and that's something that Edexcel started to do more recently. So in some of the original exams, they tend to keep them as separate questions. Some of the more recent ones, they've combined them. So do look out for the wording in your questions. So this one says, identify 2 language and or layout features used by the writer of Text C to persuade readers to reduce their sugar intake. So we can pick some of the features we've talked about, maybe alliteration, maybe direct address. Give an example to support each answer. So if I was going to use direct address, I would put direct address, then I would do a quotation. You must reduce your fizzy drink intake, end quotation. So that would be direct address. I would actually probably put direct address using your, and then I would put the quotation, and that would be enough to get the 2 marks for example 1. Then I would give a separate example there. So always make sure you're giving your example, but also make sure you're explaining. If you just give a quote but don't actually say what the technique is, you'll probably lose both of the marks because they usually say you need to identify the technique before giving the example. There'll always be a comparison question. It's always near the end, and it will ask you to compare 2 of the 3 texts. Again, normally a big mark question, 4 or 5 marks. This question tends to be not always done very well, either because people don't make enough points or because people don't make the comparison obvious. Although it's 4 or 5 marks, because it's comparing, you only really need to do 2 or 3 ideas, because within that you'll then refer to 2 texts. So that's the mark scheme is a little bit different for that question. And again, you can have a look at the mark scheme yourself, but it explains about, for the full marks, you need to look at more than 1 idea, and you need to have used comparison. So it doesn't say how many ideas you have to use exactly, but it has to be more than 1 to get the full 5 marks or the full 4 marks. And you must use some examples from the text. You can put them in your own words unless it asks you to give specific quotes. And then finally, one of the things that you need to be doing is proofreading. Now, in this sense, we're not proofreading for spelling, grammar, and punctuation, as you would do in a normal exam, because as we said, spelling isn't marked. You will go through and check everything makes sense. That's the most important bit. If you want to adjust the spelling, so spelling is important, but it's not marked. So it's not important in the sense of getting the marks for the exam. Always read back your answers in terms of reading the question and the answer again. So don't just read your answer, read the question again, then read your answer and check the 2 actually match. Check they make sense together. Because you could have misread the question before. You may have missed the apart from section. So do go back and check it. But leave yourself enough time to do that at the end. So here are my top tips for everything. Always check your answers are sensible and fit the question, as we said. Always read questions twice to check for some of those traps in the wording, like the apart from, or which paragraph you're referring to. Do learn the language and layout features. That's one of the things you need to learn in advance of the test. Be precise and concise with your quotations. Don't do big quotations. Make sure they're specific. Always answer every question. Occasionally people will come out and say, oh, I ran out of time, I didn't answer the last 3, and that probably means you won't pass. And do make sure you give enough points to match the marks that are available on the test. There are plenty of practice tests out there that you can have a look at, so do go away and have a look at some of those practice tests to make sure that you're confident. Have a go at one, then use the mark scheme to check your answers. If you're not comfortable with one test or the mark scheme, have a look at another one, because they do vary a little bit in style, and obviously the different text that you use, sometimes you'll find the text more accessible to you because the topic's a bit more familiar. Sometimes the text might be not as interesting to you and you might find it a bit harder to answer that one. So on the day, obviously you may be doing a paper test, you may be doing online. Make sure you've had a go at the online practice test if you are doing the online version. Don't do it as a practice of the questions because it won't mark it for you online. You will have to download it and mark it separately. So I wouldn't suggest doing it as an actual test. I'd suggest just going through and checking, you know, where all the buttons are, all the features. There's highlighting tools you can use, how to scroll through, how to look at the question and the text. So just make sure that you're confident with that before the day so that you're not struggling during the exam to locate all of the features of the text. And then those are my top tips. So if you need any more help with the reading exam, go and watch the different webinars on each of the specific questions. So this is just a general overview to help you with your last minute revision before you do your test. So good luck.